Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking around for our last panel of this afternoon on Iran, Israel, and the West, obviously centered to the whole topic that we're discussing this afternoon. I'll introduce the speakers. Efraim Karsh, you've already met, so I will skip his introduction. Elan Journo, my colleague at the Ayn Rand Institute, is a fellow in foreign policy at the Ayn Rand Institute and director of policy research. His book, Winning an Unwinnable War, analyzes America's response to 9/11 and looks to what we should be doing going forward. His articles have appeared in, among others, the LA Times, Chicago Sun-Times, and Canada's Globe and Mail. He's a frequent commentator on radio and television. Mr. Journo has spoken at numerous universities nationwide, including the U.S. Naval Academy, Stanford, Berkeley, UCLA, NYU, and GMU. Clare Lopez is a strategic policy and intelligence expert with a focus on national defense, Islam, Iran, and counterterrorism issues. Currently a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy and the Clarion Fund and vice president of the Intelligence Summit. She formerly was a career operations officer with the CIA, a professor at the Center of Counterintelligence and Security Studies, an executive director of Iran Policy Committee from 2005 to 6, and has served as a consultant, intelligence analyst, and researcher for a variety of defense firms. She was named a Lincoln Fellow at the Claremont Institute this summer. Ms. Lopez is Deputy Director of the U.S. Counterterrorism Advisory Team for the Military Department of the South Carolina National Guard and serves as a member of the boards of advisors and directors for the Centers for Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia, the Clarion Fund, the Institute of World Affairs, the Intelligence Analysis and Research Programs at our undergraduate alma mater, Notre Dame College of Ohio, and United West. She has been a visiting researcher and guest lecturer on counterterrorism, national defense, and international relations at Georgetown University. Ms. Lopez is a regular contributor to print and broadcast media on subjects related to Iran and the Middle East, and co-author of 2 published books on Iran. She is the author of the acclaimed paper on this, for the Center, The Rise of the Iran Lobby, and co-author editor of the Center's Team B2 study, Sharia, the Threat to America. Ms. Lopez received a BA in Communications and French from Notre Dame College of Ohio and an MA in International Relations from the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. She completed the Marine Corps Officers Candidate School in Guantanamo, Virginia, before declining a commission to join the CIA. Michael Rubin. Michael Rubin is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, senior lecturer at the Naval Postgraduate School's Center for Civil Military Relations, and a senior editor for the Middle East Quarterly. So let us begin. Each one of our commentators will do about 8 minutes on Iran, Israel, and the West. Dr. Karsh? You are, sorry.
Oh, well, no, I was waiting on this that Adam will say certain things so I could follow up. Perhaps I'll follow up from our earlier session, which was the Arab upheavals and Israel. To what extent have these changes in the Middle East affected Israel? So we'll start with the fall of Mubarak. And in a way, I'll give you the impressions how Israel see things, because I'm, expatriate Israeli and I follow it quite closely. I used to be part of the system in my earlier incarnation. Many of my friends are still there in quite influential positions. So sometimes, I can say to them, why didn't you see this? But they cannot say it anymore to me. But Mubarak, I don't know. I never thought very highly of Mubarak. I didn't think he really kept the peace. Mubarak kept the arrangement, the peace that Sadat signed, and Sadat, to an extent, I think, was sincere about this. He wanted to extricate Egypt from the Arab-Israeli conflict or from, all this pan-Arabism. And Mubarak came, and he just wanted peace and quiet on the domestic front, and he wanted American military support to come, he wanted American economic, and the money to flow in, and he kept peace at the minimum level. He never visited Israel. Israel in his entire years in power. The only time he came is for Yitzhak Rabin's funeral, which is not really a visit. And he made a point of it, and the Israelis were running after him and going to Cairo, going to Sharm el-Sheikh, and so on. Apart from Sharon, by the way, when he was prime minister, he made a point of not going to Mubarak. So the Israelis somehow, viewed Mubarak as keeping the peace, but once he was toppled, there was some surge of nostalgia, and they're competing to outdo each other on television, radio, newspapers, Mubarak and I met Mubarak, when he was still an officer and he did like this and that. I mean, with all due respect, Mubarak was bad for Israel. Mubarak didn't keep the peace, and I said Mubarak forged a culture of rabid anti-Semitism in Egypt. Egypt is probably the foremost purveyor of anti-Semitic literature, images, television programs, and so on. In the world, Mubarak was harassing Israel on its nuclear power. Mubarak was delaying Israeli-Palestinian negotiations because he wanted to keep Egypt as some kind of medium. So, I mean, he felt a big deal. Of course, we have to wait and see what comes. At the moment, it's the army. There is not much change. There are a few tactical changes in the worst direction. The open Gaza, for example, the Gaza, the Egyptian border on the Gaza Strip is open now, which means that the Hamas and the other terrorist groups don't even have to go underground to smuggle all the weapons. Maybe they do the drugs and other things, human trafficking underground, but the weapons can go now more freely. So on the whole, Egypt is more hostile. Egypt now is linked with Turkey to an extent. Erdogan is going there soon to forge an alliance of sorts. So I think, with regard to Egypt, so far the change is not that dramatic, but over the long term, the Egyptian peace may not be taken for granted. On the other side, we have Jordan. They are more sincere. If only for the reason that Israel has been saving the Hashemite regime for decades. I mean, they saved King Hussein several times. I remember as a young Israeli kid, when they launched Israeli television and Jordanian television at the same time, 68, 69, something like this. I used to watch it all the time. And even as a teenager, in school, I was taken aback by the personality cult of King Hussein, and I believed already then that the Hashemites are not going to survive for long, because if you need this kind of personality cult, obviously the regime is not very solid, but the Hashemites are more clever than I am probably, and they survived so far. But on the whole, again, I won't rule out that sooner or later the Hashemite days are over and Jordan will become a Palestinian state, with or without link to what will happen in the West Bank. Syria, as we said, we don't know. Assad is teetering. I never thought Israel should sign an agreement with the Assad clan. On the other hand, the Assad clan kept their border quiet for most of the time. I mean, only recently because they had domestic problems, so he sent his Palestinians on some kind of return trips along the border. And the Western media suddenly said that this is the Palestinian spring coming. Of course, it's the opposite, because the so-called Arab Spring was revolts or uprisings against regimes, and here the regime was sending the Palestinians against the Israelis. But such is the situation. I won't speak much about the Palestinians. They're going to the UN now, and we'll have to wait and see. And we'll go to Iran, which is the major threat to Israel. I think that's the way the Israeli establishment views it these days, the Iraqi nuclear project. I mean, they've been trying to delay it for decades, and probably they succeeded because Iran doesn't yet have it. But as things seem at the moment, unless something dramatic will happen and there will be a change of regime in this city, Iran may have a nuclear weapon, and then, of course, it's a completely different ballgame in the Middle East. So, all in all, I would say that Israel's strategic environment is becoming increasingly dire. On the other hand, if you take into account that the only reasons that the Arabs are willing to move in the direction of some kind of accommodation with Israel is the realization that Israeli power just exceeds theirs, I mean broadly defined, military, economic, technological, and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't be that surprised. I mean, I'm among those people who think, unfortunately and regrettably, because ideally I would love to see Israel signing peace with the Arabs, even if it requires some kind of concessions and living in peace. But I think that Israel will have to live by the sword for a long time to come.
Thank you. Elan?
Oh, I was also hoping to go last, but that's okay.
I'm doing the order you prepared.
Oh, I did?
For the bios.
Picking up on your comments about Iran as central to the situation, I've been...
Move your mic.
Just to pick up on your comments regarding Iran as central and a major threat, I agree, and I think one thing that's important to understand about what used to be called the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I don't really know if that's an accurate term for it anymore, is that it's really best understood as a kind of microcosm or a proxy fight between Iran, which is now backing Hamas in interesting ways, and has long been backing Hezbollah in the north, and other Islamist forces in Egypt. So, and Israel, in the eyes of its aggressors, is seen as the extension of America, not necessarily accurately, but it is in essential terms a Western country. So it's a kind of front line for this conflict. And I think it's more apt to see it that way and to recognize that some of what we've done in the last few decades has made this worse, and that puts us and Israel in a worse situation, especially with the new developments. So clearly there's a worry about the Muslim Brotherhood taking power or greater power in Egypt and rescinding or wiping out the last semblance of the agreement that they had signed years ago with Egypt. But I think that if we understand it situated that way, it is important to address it. And I think here there's an important lesson that feeds into some of the comments from earlier discussions. So one of the earlier panels, for those who weren't here, raised the question of, have we identified the threats? Do we understand the enemy? And what have we done in response to it? And I think there's a real question of whether we have understood the enemy and whether we understand its goals properly. Now, I see the Palestinian movement as now having been essentially Islamized much more than it was. People may remember it in the past as led by the likes of Arafat, but even then there was a gradual move to more religion in their rhetoric and in their actual practice. And then now I think Hamas is on the ascendancy for understandable reasons. So here we see a kind of a microcosm, and we haven't understood it properly. Because I think if we did, we'd see this as much more important than will the Palestinians go get their homes back, which is the issue of the dispossession. Will they have enough land for a state? I think all of those issues are really peripheral to the central question of, will this state, which embodies political freedom, economic freedom, will this state survive in the face of essentially a jihadist front led by Iran as part of its larger jihadist effort to expand the realm of a totalitarian Islamist regime? I think that's kind of the context for the conflict as I see it, focusing on Iran and Israel. I want to say a word about what we've done in response to this. So I think partly as a result of not understanding the problem in this way, we've approached it, and this is kind of an entrenched establishment view of what the solution is. So I think it's now dying, or at least I hope it's dead, this idea of a peace process or a concession with some of the Arabs in order to get some peace. Well, one of the most successful, or seemed to be most successful deals was with Egypt, and as you pointed out, it was a very cold peace, and not reliable and now perhaps in danger. The question is that model of having Israel and the Palestinians, whoever it is that is even legitimate to speak for the Palestinians, it's not clear that's known, is that model of having them come to a table and negotiate actually sound? Because the big debate isn't should we have that model right now. The debate is, can we implement it properly? Can we learn from the mistakes of the last failed attempt, and there'll be a series of these attempts to bring some kind of negotiated settlement to the table? And I disagree with most of the views there, because I think it's inherently destructive, and I think it is inappropriate as a model for how to resolve it, because it's not an issue over minute differences of opinion that can be resolved through a compromise. It is a kind of war. And if you understand that, you have to take a step back and realize, how do wars properly end and lead to peace? They don't end by surrendering your home guard and giving your enemy what it wants, because that's not a good outcome for you. And so the essential issue here is that model, built into it is the pushing aside of assessing the two sides. It's kind of a morally gray perspective. So the first point I said is the situation is understood in terms of what are the adversaries, what is their character, and the fact that it's an Islamist front in effect. That's not understood. And the approach, what has long been called the peace process, which I think is losing credibility, that institutionalizes the view that you shouldn't question the moral status of each side. You should just treat them as they are and find some common ground. You can't find common ground when there isn't any. And that's sort of the lesson of the last 17, 18 years worth of attempts to do this. And I don't think it's a question of, well, they didn't find the right combination of incentives and the right leaders. I think that misses the larger forest for the details, because there's a fundamental difference between bringing together two parties that have some common ground, that both have some moral legitimacy, and then hashing out some minor details. Like if I were going to buy your car, Michael, we both agree I have to pay some price because it's a trade. If I hold a gun to your head and I say, let me buy your car, that's not a trade, right? We know what that is. That's extortion. That's really what's going on, and we haven't identified it as such. And by pushing for concessions, and Obama made this big overture as soon as he came to power, pushing Israel to now you really have to knuckle down and show that you're serious. Well, leaving aside the inversion of who should be seen as the guilty party here, that is exactly the model that encourages greater militancy, right? So we saw during George Bush's administration, Israel's retreat from Gaza. What did the Islamists say after that? Gaza today, the West Bank and Jerusalem tomorrow. That was their slogan. And their view isn't that this is going to be resolved through negotiation. Their view is that they're going to win through attrition. Some of them have different views, but that's the model they're following. And that's made possible by a kind of model in which you treat the two sides as morally equal when they're not. And that gives the advantage to the side that is hostile. Hostile not just to Israel, because I think this is bigger. It's hostile to the values that America stands for. So just to sum this up, I think part of the issue here in understanding the conflict and its larger implications is that, as with the larger 9/11 context, do we understand the Islamist threat? I don't think we do in this context, which is a narrower case, and I don't think we've dealt with it properly in the same way that, as part of my book, I critique the response to 9/11. So we don't understand the enemy properly. We haven't dealt with it properly, and our approach has, in effect, been our worst enemy. So our policies have weakened us, put us in a worse position, put Israel in a worse position, and empowered and strengthened the enemy. In this case, Hamas, which is an Iran-backed proxy, and Hezbollah. And you can multiply that in different dimensions. So I'll draw a line there.
Thank you, Elan. Lopez?
Thank you. What I'd like to do is to talk about Iran in the context of perhaps 3 ticking clocks. And I will keep an eye on my own as we go along. The first of these would be the macro level, regionally, talking about Iran in terms of the broader Middle East issues that some of the previous panels and speakers have touched on. The second will be the internal dynamic within Iran and what is going on inside the country, inside the regime. And then thirdly, the ticking time clock regarding Iran's nuclear weapons program. So to talk about the broader issue first, and I was glad to hear some of the earlier panelists, for instance, Dr. Phares, and then also on the last panel, Dr. Lewis and also Diana West, talking about this unified ideology that binds together the opponents in what might be called the Islamic awakening. Iran is absolutely at the heart and soul of that Islamic awakening, of that Islamic onslaught against the West. What is that ideology? What is that unifying ideology? It is the ideology of Sharia Islam. And in this case, what we're talking about is a unification between or among Sunnis and Shia. There is no differentiation in the sense that, as Dr. Lewis put it in the last panel, the objective, or perhaps it was Diana West actually, but the objective of jihad, of terrorism, is to pave the way, to set the stage, to set the conditions for the imposition of Sharia, of Islamic law. And so when we talk about Iran being at the heart and the soul of this, we are talking about a regime that is absolutely dedicated to Sharia, not only in its own territory in Iran, but in a revolutionary sense, and this is in its own constitution, to expand that ideology and the imposition of Sharia outwards into the surrounding area of the Middle East, and even more broadly, as we see in our own hemisphere. The other thing we see in Iran's constitution is that, in this regard, the Iranian regime, while it declares itself to be adherent to the Twelver sect of the Jafari jurisprudential school of Shia Islam, in its own constitution of 1989, explicitly approves of or accepts the legitimacy of the other four schools of Sunni jurisprudence: Hanafi, Hanbali, Shafi, and Maliki. So you've got that unification of purpose there. And what are those? What is the purpose? The purpose is to reinstate the caliphate, or perhaps imamate in the case of the Shia, and number two, impose Islamic law globally. These are the two objectives that unite Iran and all of its allies, meaning Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, its proxies, and also allies such as Taliban and the terrorist militias inside of Iraq. So when we're looking at this phenomenon, this so-called Arab Spring, and we see the role of Iran uniting closely and providing verbal and explicit support to, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which it has done. By the way, the homepage of the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, it's in many languages, English is one of them, but very shortly after the revolution in Egypt broke out, the homepage of the Supreme Leader of Iran was dedicated to a paean of support for the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. And then shortly thereafter, the Iranian regime invited members of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood to Tehran, or to be on its government-controlled media, television, and so forth for interviews. So we see that there is this unification of purpose. I would suggest, as Diana West mentioned the last panel, that at the top and the overarching authority for all of this perhaps is the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, the OIC. This is the 57-member head of state organization of all Islamic countries in the world, plus the Palestinians, which has expressly devoted its website to this agenda, if you will, which is the imposition of Sharia on the world. And oh, by the way, the express purpose of its particular 10-year period that it is in right now, and its particular 10-year objective, is the criminalization of the criticism of Islam, in which our own government and Department of State, Hillary Clinton, is a party, which would bring the countries of the world that kowtow to this into compliance with Sharia law on slander. All right, so that is sort of the broader look at the region and Iran's role in it. Its support for terrorist proxies like Hamas, like Hezbollah, its work, by the way, 20-year alliance, operational terrorist alliance with Al-Qaeda, the responsibility together with Al-Qaeda for the attacks not just of Khobar Towers in 1996, the East Africa Embassy bombings in 1998, the USS Cole attack in 2000, but also, yes, 9/11. You can find the details of that attack in the Havlish case, a legal case filed in the Southern District of New York, May of this year, 2011, on our website where all the documents are located. It is at www.iran911case.com. I co-wrote one of the affidavits in that case. It provides clear and compelling evidence that Iran provided direct and material support and had foreknowledge of the attacks of 9/11 together with Al-Qaeda. All right, the regional. Moving in closer to within Iran itself, we are looking at a regime which I heard described earlier as hollowed out. It is coming apart, it is coming unglued on the inside, and this is a great thing to see. Not just the very visible 2009 demonstrations by literally millions of its own people on the streets before they were brutally suppressed, but rather what else is going on behind the scenes in Iran. And what else is going on behind the scenes is that the actual fathers, if you will, or the founders of the revolution themselves are at each other's throats. The long knives are out for each other within the regime. And if you look at those elections from 2009, you saw the opposition to the incumbent president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and who was part of the opposition coalition. You had Mehdi Karoubi, you had Mir Hussein Mousavi, and you had Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani. These guys were all founding fathers. I hate to use that term, I shouldn't. These were the founders of the Iranian Revolution back in 1979. They had come into opposition with the regime itself and against Ahmadinejad. Let's look at Ahmadinejad himself. More recently, this year in particular, we've seen evidence of a real rift inside of the regime between Ahmadinejad and the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. And it has burst into the public scene with public statements, press conferences, declarations. It would appear that Ahmadinejad thinks himself perhaps more powerful than he actually is, that he had amassed more power and support perhaps inside of the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC or Pasdaran, than he actually had. He put himself up in competition almost, as it were, to the supreme leader, who had to forcibly put him down. We saw the evidence of this rift in things like the emergence of that movie, which was referenced previously. Reza Khalili, the name used by the former Pasdaran defector, wrote the book called A Time to Betray. That's also the name of his website, atimeToBetray.com. And Reza brought to our attention earlier this year a movie called The Coming is Upon Us. That's the translation in English. And it was a movie created by the president's office, apparently under his supervision, to talk about the end times scenario, the millennialist ideology, the return of the 12th Imam, and the beginning of the end times scenario. Well, that movie was not really ever supposed to get out of Iran. It was meant for an internal audience. It had been screened apparently for the supreme leader himself and other members, senior members, clerics, and others of the regime. But it got out. It came to Western internet, and people saw it, and it was embarrassing. The supreme leader, despite having viewed it, seen it, and presumably approved of it, turned on Ahmadinejad and blamed him for putting the regime in a bad light. One example of the rift bursting into public. Another, of course, was the conflict over certain appointees of Ahmadinejad's cabinet, in particular his intelligence minister, whom he desired to fire earlier this year, and the supreme leader basically put his foot down and said, no, I am the supreme leader, that's why he gets that name. You will not fire him, even though you get to name members of your cabinet, but in this case, the intelligence portfolio was just too important to let Ahmadinejad control it. The supreme leader stepped in and said, Haidar Moslehi is his name, the intelligence minister, I should say, will stay, and he stayed. So evidence of internal rifts within the regime itself, coming apart, coming unglued, opponents and animosity within, with some very caustic comments being made in public. Finally, very quickly, let me talk about the third ticking clock, if you will, for Iran, and that is about its nuclear weapons program. If anyone has had the chance to look at, for instance, the May and then the July this year, 2011, reports that come out of the IAEA, you'll have seen that the IAEA, now under new leadership since the retirement last year of the former Supreme, the head of the IAEA, Mohammed Baradei, retired. New leadership now. The IAEA is becoming more candid in its reporting, and so I'm referencing the May and the July reports, which are very frank about the extent of Iran's nuclear weapons program, talking about foreign assistance, talking about working with the explosive triggers that would set off the warhead, talking about the ability to form and shape that warhead, as in miniaturizing to fit on top of the missiles, which we know that Iran already has. They have tested them, the Shahab 3 series and the Sajil series, as well as their satellite program, which demonstrates they can reach, put a payload into orbit. So all of these things demonstrate, I think, a candidness on the part of the IAEA, but what's in the reports is very disturbing, I think, and shows the extent of the program, which is they have the ability to enrich basically as high as they want to. The regime in Iran has already said they were going to move enrichment to the Fordow or Qom site for enrichment from Natanz to Fordow, more protected, bunker-protected facility under a mountain, under tunnels and bunkers and so forth, openly flaunting their ability to hide and conceal their program and to enrich. So they've got the enrichment, they've got the highly enriched uranium, potential, if not actual stocks. They certainly have stocks of low enriched uranium. They have the triggering devices, that is the explosive charges that sets off the chain reaction of the warhead. They've got the warhead, and they've got the missiles. All that remains really is to marry these up, and they will have a deliverable nuclear weapon. We don't know or don't have firm information that that has happened yet, but I would expect it is only a matter of time, given that they have all of these other elements in place, that marrying up of the elements is simply a matter of time. We know, for instance, from the Pakistani program that they had the ability to deliver a nuclear weapon. They had a nuclear weapon perhaps as long as 6 years before they finally tested openly in 1998 in response to the Indian tests earlier the same year. So, 3 ticking time clocks, the regional upheaval, if you will, what is going on inside of the regime, and then the nuclear program inside of Iran, which will tick faster, which clock will tick faster, which will come to fruition faster or have the greater effect, remains to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm used to lecturing to the military audience, and in the military audience, they always talk about so-called bluff, bottom line up front. So what I'm going to do is my bottom line up front, and then so that we don't go over time, if you want me to go into any further details on any of the points I'm going to make, by all means, we can cover that during questions and answers. But I have 3 main points, some of which also correspond to the points which Ms. Lopez made. The first is that ideology matters, and I'll talk about that in a second. Overconfidence also matters, is my second point, and that factions matter, although not necessarily in the way which are often described. Now, I spent 14 years in a Quaker school, twice in kindergarten because 2 years in kindergarten because I kept eating the Play-Doh. And I was also a Congressional Black Caucus Foundation fellow, believe it or not, about 20 years ago. And so I always learned and was indoctrinated about this idea of multiculturalism. But too often in the West, when we talk about multiculturalism, it's celebrating the ability to go into a sushi restaurant and order a mojito. But fundamentally, when we talk about multiculturalism, we need to recognize that different people think in fundamentally different ways. One of the major problems we have with regard to our diplomacy towards Iran, and also, frankly, with regard to mainstream intelligence analysis with regard to Iran, is engaging in projection, assuming that people who are raised in a different system think, or in a different culture, think like we do. And I'm not talking about the broader array of Iranians right now, because ultimately, inside Iran, it doesn't matter what the Iranian people think. What matters is what the regime thinks. It's the guys with the guns that matter. Now, not all Iranians, for example, when it comes to Israel, are anti-Semitic. And I specify anti-Semitism here rather than anti-Zionism here, because really when one looks at some of the interplay between Iran and the Jews, there's lots of positive stories there. But also you have the pogroms in Tabriz and Mashhad in the 19th century. And certainly much more recently when one looks at the writings of Khomeini, going back to his days in Najaf and so forth, not just as the supreme leader, there certainly is a great deal of not only anti-Israel animus, but plain outright anti-Semitism. That's not something that when I lived in Iran, I experienced with any regularity. Quite to the contrary, Iranians were far more cosmopolitan than pretty much any of the peoples around them, and far more tolerant. But among the upper caste of the regime, certainly the ideology of Khomeini is the ideology that mattered. Now, we too often will look at the youth in Iran and again engage in this mirror imaging and assume that the youth in Iran want the same thing as the youth in the United States. And certainly, to some degree, many of the youth do. I mean, Iranians are fiercely nationalistic. They don't want to become the United States. But among the youth, there is a greater desire for freedom, a greater desire for liberty, and so forth. But at the same time, I have a friend who's Iranian who escaped about a year or two after the revolution. It took some time to get the whole family out. And so he went to kindergarten during the revolution, first grade as well. And, I mean, he was about to murder his mother a few times because now, whenever he would bring home a girl who she didn't approve of, she would pull out the audio tape of little, I'm not going to say his name, chanting revolutionary slogans. The point of this is indoctrination matters. Many Iranians may not believe it fully, but conspiracy theories do grow when there is a vacuum of full access to information. And that's something which we're going to be living with even if the regime collapses tomorrow. Now, the positive and the negative side of when I talk about the youth is the whole issue of demography. As an academic, I said I have 3 points and I'm going to make a fourth. Demography also matters. Too many people look at the Arab Spring and assume that Iran's the same way. One of the first things Khomeini did when he led the Islamic Revolution was ban contraception, and then you had these posters go up that showed a good Islamic family with a mother, a child, a mother, a father, and 8 children. After the war, however, the Iran-Iraq War, he discovered that you could have a revolution over the price of a watermelon. He discovered that condoms were legal under Islamic law anyway, and posters went up, a mother, a father, and 1 child. The point of this is that Iran's birth rate is half of what it was in the 1980s. Its growth rate is less than that of the United States today. And what that means is when you look back at the June 2009 uprising, well, we tend to assume that once you let the genie of reform out of the bottle, it's inevitable, you can't put it back in. When you read Sobi Zadok and the other Revolutionary Guard publications, they very much believe that there's going to be fewer 20-somethings who are replacing the ones that settle down and have families, and that therefore, every year they can go forward, perhaps with this false and insincere approach to diplomacy or kicking the can down the road on the nuclear negotiations, the more easy it will be for them to hold on to power. Now, overconfidence also matters. I had some poor research assistant, I should say during the earthquake in Washington. I mean, I felt the earthquake and not a problem. Then I noticed the whole building had been evacuated and no one had told me about it. And I resolved that better be nicer to the interns. At any rate, I had some interns go back and look at red lines. For example, whenever we gave a statement that Iran had to do this or the consequence would be that, and to see how many had been violated. And I'm talking about things we've got to have, unless Iran suspends uranium enrichment by the G20 summit in Pittsburgh, there will be crippling sanctions immediately, and of course that didn't happen. During the Bush administration, the Obama administration, I've counted at least 28 different incidents of red lines that have been declared and violated, and what that does is convince the Iranians that they don't have to take us seriously. On top of that, a lot of people put a lot of good faith in people-to-people dialogue. The problem with this, going back to the year 2000, the height of the dialogue of civilizations, we gave the Iranian passport holders 20,000 visas. They gave us in the same year about 700 visas, which basically means that those who are able to go off and interact with the Iranians are those who the Iranians believe will tell them what they want to hear. And in that case, it also leads to a greater misunderstanding of what American red lines actually are, because too often when Americans go off, non-Iranian Americans go off to Iran, they will not talk about terrorism, they will not talk about the nuclear program, they will get there and they will bash the United States. And ultimately, they have the right to bash the United States, but what I'm concerned about is this sycophantic circle around the supreme leader and the principalists and so forth who might actually believe this nonsense and will cause them to fundamentally underestimate us. Now, this, of course, comes into play when we look back at the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah, where afterwards Nasrallah said, if I had known how the Israelis would have reacted, I never would have done this in the first place. When I went to Beirut last year, shortly after Ahmadinejad's visit there, I went down into southern Beirut and some time in southern Lebanon. You had all the posters up along the airport road, Hush Ahmadi, Rais, and so forth. At any rate, what Lebanese pointed out to me was that Ahmadinejad, of course, gave all these public statements all over the place, all these rallies, but Nasrallah never got on the platform with him. And the reason is Nasrallah knows what the red lines are now, and he understands that his actions have consequences. I'm afraid that the Iranians don't understand that. The third point, actually point C on this second point, is that containment is a military strategy. And too often in the United States we talk about it as a rhetorical strategy. If the Iranians don't see us actually implement, first of all, I don't think containment will work for reasons I'm about to explain. But if we talk about containment being our strategy, but then we don't implement it, that encourages the Iranians to believe that we're paper tigers. And by that, let's go back to the reflagging of the Kuwaiti tankers. First day of that operation, one of the ships hit a mine. First question for a containment regime. Do we have enough minesweepers in the Persian Gulf? If a ship hits the mine, do we have the facilities to take care of even our largest ships? Do we have the missiles deployed to protect those facilities? Do we have the troops deployed in the region to act as tripwires? And so forth. Containment is a very precise military strategy. We haven't done the preparations for it. We can debate that elsewhere, whether containment is a viable strategy, but the worst thing we can do is talk about it and not do it. The last point is that factions matter. Clare Lopez talked a great deal about the political factions, and that's important. What I worry about within the intelligence community and in general is that for all we talk about the political factions, the reformers versus the principalists and so forth, we never really talk about the factions within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which I would argue are far more important than the factions inside Iranian politics, because Iranian politics is basically a sham. It all rests with the supreme leader. Now, in this case, the IRGC remains a big black box, but if Iran is on the verge of getting a nuclear weapons program, or nuclear weapons, I should say, I want to know who has custody, who has command and control. Because ultimately, what they believe is what concerns us. At what point in time will this individual gentleman or this committee of 2 or 3 people who have the nukes in their possession, will they decide how will they act, that sort of thing. Now, I wrote an article about this, and the reason why I don't believe containment will work and traditional deterrence will work is this. Everyone talks about the Iranian regime not being suicidal. Let's put aside that debate for a second. There are, even if you would assume that the Iranian regime isn't suicidal, and it is, and this is a hypothetical, it is interested in self-preservation. What happens if you have a situation like in June 2009, where there's an uprising, but this time the Mosaic Doctrine fails, some security forces, or perhaps even parts of IRGC, certain factions join in and join with the people? What happens if instead of having a failed uprising, like you had in 2009, you have a situation like Romania in the last days of Ceausescu? In the last couple hours before the regime falls, before Khamenei is in front of that firing squad, what's to stop the Revolutionary Guard in that case from launching any weapons it has in its possession? After all, would we really retaliate against a regime that has already changed? And the answer to that is no. At least the Iranians don't, I don't believe so, the Iranians don't believe so. During the September 2007 primary debates, Democratic primary debates, both then Senator Biden and then Senator Obama castigated then Senator Clinton for suggesting that if Iran used nukes that we would annihilate them. And we have to remember, deterrence is as much a psychological strategy as it is a military strategy. So in this case, there is a big loophole in this idea of deterrence working. And with that, let me conclude. There's lots of details we can go in any of these 3+ points, but the most interesting discussion is always that in the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you. A lot's being brought up. We have 2 mics, so feel free if you have any questions to go up to the mics. Let me just start by asking you guys this. So let's say the ticking time bomb explodes, or whatever happens to the ticking time bomb, right? The middle one. The regime falls apart, or the June-like revolution is successful. What replaces this regime in Iran? Is there a what are kind of the scenarios that are most likely to replace the current regime in Iran if it happens internally like that?
I'll go ahead and start. One of the things to note, and I forget which of the earlier speakers mentioned this, is that the Iranian population is not like the rest of the populations in countries elsewhere in the Middle East, Egyptian or Libyan or what have you. They are not only overwhelmingly young and under the 60% or something under the age of 30, but they are also very pro-Western. By polling, by Pew, by Gallup, by whomever it is that goes in there and does polling on a regular basis, consistently the Iranian population comes back as overwhelmingly pro-Western, and not just pro-Western in the sense of pro-America, but rather pro-Western concepts. We'll recall perhaps that the Iranians have been seeking a democratic system for well over 100 years now, beginning with its own first constitutional revolution in 1906, when it instituted its first parliament, prime minister constitution. Unsuccessful, but they have kept on trying to do that. So I think that you would have a very different situation than you have currently with the regime. You have a population that really has given up on Islam. It's not that they've converted to anything else. They've just had it up to here with Islam, and mosque attendance is probably lower than in Western Europe in the churches. It's abysmally low. There is no more ideological belief. And remember, too, that if the majority of these young people are under the age of 30, that means that they did not know the regime of the Shah. They know it in the history books. They didn't grow up with that. They grew up under the revolution, and they're fed up with this revolution and the restrictions and the oppression and the savagery of the brutality of the put-down after the 2009 fraudulent elections and the demonstrations which followed. The bond, if there ever was one, of legitimacy between the people and this regime is, I think, unalterably broken. It doesn't mean that they're going to take power tomorrow or that the regime will fall tomorrow, no. But rather that, if, as you say, if it does fall, what is likely to take its place, I think, is a lot more positive than is what is much more very likely to take place in Egypt or Libya right now.
I'll just add a couple points to that. One of the biggest misconceptions that many people in the West have is that the Green Movement is somehow homogenous. The Green Movement is not. There's a certain faction, a very vocal faction in the Green Movement, which really is loyal to the Islamic Republic. This is this concept of laissez-faire. They're basically the same as they're reformers in wolf's clothing, basically, or in green clothing, so to speak. But then you have many of the other youth and so forth that basically decided they wanted something more. They no longer have any faith in this concept of laissez-faire. That said, Iranians, in my experience, tend to be cautious Iranians inside Iran, because after all, they were promised an Islamic democracy by Khomeini. Khomeini had said he didn't have any interest in personal power. Of course, that wasn't true. But they got a war that killed 1 million people, or in popular belief, 1 million people, probably a little bit less than that. The point being, it has created an impediment to some degree in the political development. Now, I agree with Clare Lopez on the importance of the Mashrutia, the constitutional revolution, as a precedent. Certainly there is an indigenous precedent there, which Iranians remember. That said, when I talked about indoctrination before, when I was in Tehran to give a historical presentation on the 90th anniversary of the Mashrutia, what surprised me was just how ferociously the regime was trying to have the historians there write in the importance of the ulama to the extent, to the detriment of the liberals, the constitutionalists, and others. Again, indoctrination matters, and even the most westward-leaning youth don't necessarily always understand where they have been led astray in certain cases. What I'm worried about, I don't think it's all going to be smooth in Iran when change comes. I do see change. I don't think you're going to have incremental reform. You're going to have, Iran's a tinderbox. The question is whether the government is better at putting out the sparks than the opposition is at creating them. But ultimately, you're going to have a wildfire, and I think it's going to look like Romania. I worry about Iranian nationalism to some extent. Nationalism can be good, nationalism can be bad. At the very best, I think that Iran is going to be like France on steroids. But what I'm worried about is, given the diversity of Iran, most ethnic groups in Iran, since the Iranian state really predates this 19th century concept of ethno-nationalism being the basis of nationhood, are pretty patriotic, which is why when I was in government, I always opposed the regional strategies. That said, among the Kurds and among some others, there are some regional sentiments, and this can lead to, it can allow some of the ethnic groups to be useful whipping boys for any populist leader that wants to play on those trends. And last point, and it may not be something which everyone in this room wants to hear, is because, as Ms. Lopez said, most Iranians don't remember the Shah. They were born after or came of age after the Shah. In reality, there's not going to be much role inside Iran for any Iranian diaspora to return, because one of the biggest impediments from within Iran, among the apolitical bureaucrats, if you will, would be the idea that people from outside would come back to take their jobs. You're going to have a decapitation inside Iran, but you're going to have a lot of the bureaucracy remain the same. And what a lot of people forget is this is exactly what happened also during the Islamic Republic, Islamic Revolution, where they may have killed, for all their anti-Sadat rhetoric, they may have killed the top level and the second tier, but then they invited back the same bureaucrats to help form the Bid'ah and so forth. And with that, thank you.
Yeah.
I remember in the moments, it seemed like moments, following Mubarak's removal and the military replacing him, the Iranians had sent, I believe, I'm not sure if it was a warship exactly, but they did send a ship through the Suez Canal, and it got very noticeably close to Israel. Assuming that this is not a monolithic movement in the Arab world right now, what can Iran gain or not gain, given the massive amounts of uncertainty?
Well, you're right about your memory of what happened there. It was within 2 weeks, actually, after the fall of Mubarak. The military regime that took over allowed 2 Iranian warships to pass through the Suez Canal. And that would have been the first time such a thing had happened since the 1979 revolution in Iran. Obviously a provocative move, obviously aimed at provoking a response from Israel, which stood up its defenses but didn't fall for the bait of a provocation. But it does sort of preview what could happen if the Iranian regime follows through with and the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood follows through if it, as is likely, becomes the power in Egypt, either by sheer numbers in the election or the power more broadly behind the scenes. If these 2 regimes then do follow through with their mutual expressions of support and desire to reestablish relations, diplomatic relations, full relations, and this gets back then to the unifying ideology that I was talking about before. The Muslim Brotherhood and the Iranian regime and Al-Qaeda have all exactly the same 2 objectives: reestablish the caliphate or imamate and impose Sharia law. Now, yes, there are a whole bunch of other objectives, including geographic and geostrategic objectives, and Iran within its own country has objectives and so forth. That's all true. But the enmity, for one thing, the Jew hatred and the enmity to Jews and to Israel is common to all 3 of these: Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, Iran. And so I think it would be a very worrisome development to see, first of all, if the Muslim Brotherhood does indeed become the power in Egypt, outright the power, and if that rapprochement, if you will, between these two regimes takes place.
Yeah, sorry.
I will say one comment. I mean, Michael said about overestimating. I mean, I wouldn't overestimate Iran. I mean, I've written a book about Islamic imperialism, so I'm not going to dispute the fact that Khomeini views basically Islam as his goal is basically Islam prevailing all over the world, and that's the ideal of other what we call Islamists and Muslim Brotherhood and others. But there are Sunnis and there are Shiites, and sooner or later they don't want the same caliphate. They want the 12-year, they don't want the 12-year. Sooner or later they are going to fall out with each other, so they can cooperate up to a point, but not beyond this. And in this respect, for example, I don't think that Hamas is an Iranian stooge. It may be good for Israel propaganda to say, yes, Israel is surrounded now by Iran, they have their proxies. No, Hamas is not. Hamas is originally basically part of the Muslim Brotherhood, that still attached to the Muslim Brotherhood much more than Iran, and it's dangerous enough on its own. So we don't have to put Iran as the one that pulling the string. Of course, the Muslim Hamas wants to benefit from Iran. They have weapons, they have money, they can help it. But to an extent, even Arafat. And by the way, Arafat was far more religious than people assume. All this image that PLO is secular, Hamas is religious, is wrong. The PLO, the founders of the PLO, they got their education in the Muslim Brotherhood. Arafat, basically is an Egyptian. He grew up in Egypt. I mean, he doesn't qualify as Palestinian by the Palestinian covenant of the organization on which he presided. Because he was born in Egypt, grew up in Egypt, his family was in Egypt, so he didn't grow up in Palestine at the time that it counted. And he was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood when he was young, and some of Abu Yad and others. So PLO had a much deeper religious aspect to it, but even if not, the PLO got weapons from Iran. I mean, there was this Karin aid that Israel intercepted at the time, which was instrumental in swinging the Bush administration against the PLO. So, yes, I mean, I agree that this regime is a nasty piece of work, and the sooner it goes, the better. But on the other hand, I don't think we are witnessing beyond tactical cooperation, the axis of the so-called caliphate or Sharia.
Yeah, I can add a couple of points. I think what's really kind of a worst-case scenario is that maybe there'll be tactical agreements, as you suggest, and Iran gains, but even if there aren't, but there's chaos, which I think is a conceivable scenario, chaos is a great opportunity. I mean, chaos is what Lebanon lived through for decades, and that became a huge opportunity for people to come in, people like Iran to come in and rebuild up Hezbollah. And I think in either case, and maybe there are other scenarios, but I think those are likely ones, I don't think that the fact that they have shared ideological goals means that they're going to have Catholic marriages, in effect, to mix metaphors. In effect, they'll have an alliance that lasts forever, and there won't be. There's definitely factionalism, and they'll disagree. But there's a dynamic that underlies the Middle East, which it kind of has two faces. One is this tribal view, which is you're against them, we're against them, we're together against them, even if the day after we'll go at each other's throats. Right? This whole idea. My brother and I against my cousin, and my cousin and I against the neighbors, that kind of thing. And that's a very powerful dynamic, and it's magnified when there is a common goal, a common ideological goal, which I think explains to some extent why they are willing to breach the divide of Sunni Shiite, because then they can put that aside for the moment if there's a larger goal that they're willing to come together over. But the other aspect of it is that there's a reverence for power and strength. And one thing that Iran has done for a long time is really beat its chest and poke its finger at the West in myriad ways. I mean, we saw the Iranian hostage crisis. We saw all kinds of things like the Rushdie affair. And people forget these, but these were momentous for the Iranian regime in learning about what it could get away with. And to the extent that it's able to do this over time in different ways and periodically checking how far they can go. And I think the US non-response to the Green Movement was really a powerful green light for the regime. In effect, the Green Movement, a lot of the people in the streets in Iran were saying, we renounce we challenge the legitimacy of the supreme religious leader, which is, that you could be killed for that, right? And they were saying that. What did the Obama administration say? Nothing, and in effect endorsed the regime by allowing it to stay in power. So those kinds of things are really powerful in encouraging Iran. And so to the extent that Iran can paint itself in the eyes of people in Egypt and the rest of the region as we're the really strong force here, that can rally support and encourage people to, well, yeah, we're going to send you some trainers, some Hezbollah officers, the Quds force are going to come in and show you how we trained Hezbollah. They went into Iraq, they did this. Having their people come and train is a benefit to Iran because it means there's an opportunity maybe to set up a beachhead. So that there are all kinds of small ways in which they can bridge divides, form common alliances, even if they're temporary. That's still a bad outcome for us if they do join forces. And there's a lot of opportunity for them to the extent that there is upheavals and chaos, which I think is going to be a lot of.
I did my dissertation on 19th century telegraph in Iran, and seldom I get a captive audience, but there's actually a telegraph joke, which is directly relevant to this question. It's about an Egyptian archaeologist and a Persian archaeologist at a conference together. The Egyptian archaeologist said, we just found a tomb in the Valley of the Kings that on the hieroglyphics on the wall, it had pictures of towers, and then we found corroded bits of metal, and so it's clear that ancient Egypt had the telegraph. And the Persian archaeologist said, that's nothing. We just opened a tomb in Naqshi Jamshid, and we found on the wall carvings and such, but there were no towers, and we didn't find any corroded metal. And so the point is that ancient Persia had the wireless. The point of this is that nationalism still matters in this regard. And one of the biggest mistakes, if we look at Iraq, that the United States made, in my opinion, was allowing ourselves formally to be underestimating the psychological impact of occupation, allow ourselves to be labeled occupying power. The biggest mistake that the Iranians made time and time again was underestimating the importance of nationalism. They're like the Turks. They believe that everyone else has much fonder memories of them than they actually have. Now, what I worry about is underestimating the capacity of the Iranians to screw things up themselves and over-relying and compensating by reaching out to the Saudis, who can be just as malignant and influenced as the Iranians are in a place like Egypt. When I look at the declassified cables from the late 1990s and see the US diplomats who are negotiating with the Taliban suggest sending the Talibs to Saudi Arabia so that they can learn moderation, this is why my hair is falling out. The last point I want to make, which is really just a side point, is when we look at the ships going through the Suez Canal, that's short-term symbolic action. Certainly it's worrisome. But what I focus on whenever I lecture to the U.S. Navy is what exactly are the Iranians doing with their port facility in Jask, outside the Strait of Hormuz. We focus so much on the Strait of Hormuz that we forget that Iran has quite a coastline outside it. And when you look at Iranian rhetoric, they will often talk about themselves not as a regional power, but as a pan-regional power. And sometimes I do think that it's important to listen to the rhetoric to get an idea of where a country might be going.
Thank you. We're out of time, so let me just make a few comments. First, this is being live streamed online, and I think we're up to over 900 people have been watching this afternoon, so that's pretty cool. The power of the internet is pretty amazing. You can get a small group here, but the video now will live forever, and thousands of people will watch it. I want to thank all the panelists from today. I think the conversation has been really enlightening. I think it's somewhat sad, I have to say, that 10 years after 9/11, it feels like we're still having the same conversations that we were having right after 9/11 in terms of educating the vast majority of the American public in terms of the nature of the threat and what is going on in the world and the danger to the security and to their own lives. But on the plus side, I think after 9/11 there were probably a handful of people doing this educating. The number of people today dedicated to enlightening Americans, our politicians, our intellectuals, and the American people themselves has grown dramatically. We've seen a small number of represented here this afternoon, and I'd like to thank the panelists again, and thank you all for coming. There's a reception with some free drinks and stuff, so you're all welcome to stick around for that.